Hello everybody. Petrol heads in Britain do like themselves a luxury car. If ever I do a video on a 7 Series, an S-Class or a Lexus LS, it tends to do fairly well. And it could easily be argued that we make some of the finest in the world, in the guise of Bentley and a Rolls-Royce. We also really like a French car. Yet, when it comes to buying luxury, nobody ever thinks French. And today, I'm asking the simple question, why exactly is that? You find me today behind the wheel of a Peugeot 407 Coupe. Now the 407 full stop is a car that I've got quite a fondness for because my first ever car was a 407 SW, that's the estate, with the 1.6 diesel engine, but at the time it was a fabulous car and it was responsible for many of my first motoring memories, so it'll always hold a special place in my heart. When I then came to revisit the 407 over a decade later, now being a YouTuber, having driven all sorts of stuff, I was worried that that memory was going to be shattered and I was going to be reminded why it is that just about nobody else seems to like it. However, sitting myself in the coupe that I did, I instead found myself wondering why nobody else seemed to like the 407, because it was a really, really good car. Yes, the looks of all of them, especially perhaps the coupe, are a little bit weird. However, inside, it is a very nice thing. And these in particular were even built on a separate production line, so the quality was just that little bit better. This particular car has been brought to me by the lovely Lewis and his partner Kirsten. They have between them brought me a number of other cars, all of which I think to date have been French, including recently the Citroën C5 that you all tuned in for and really enjoyed. Thank you for that, and also her Peugeot CC, and I'm sure some other stuff too that I think I may have forgotten. They have a YouTube channel and production company called Limitless Media, and if you want to know a little bit more about what they do, please check that out. I'll leave a link in the description down below. This particular 407 Coupe is rather remarkable for a couple of reasons. First off, it has the 3-litre turbo diesel in it, which in factory guise made about 240 horsepower and 450 newton meters of torque. That's about 330 pound-foot. This already makes it something of a rarity. The 407 Coupe was already an unusual sight on the roads of Britain even when new, but paired with one of the larger engines, either the earlier 2.7 diesel, this 3-litre, or the phenomenally hard to find 3-litre petrol V6, it is a genuine find. I know that he's wanted one of these for quite some time, and he was very excited when he finally managed to track one down, and he also was very keen for me to get behind the wheel, but I struggled a little bit because I thought, okay, this is great, this is lovely, this is a very, very cool car. How am I going to make something out of it? And this is how I arrived at the topic of today's video. But before that, the other thing that makes this car remarkable is the fact that, like his previous vehicles, it's also an example of modified French. And I think there is something inherently cool about that. Although I will be honest and say that a lot of what has happened to this car isn't really to my taste. It has been remapped, now makes about 290 horsepower and near 600 newton meters of torque. That's quite an uplift, so when you put your foot down it certainly goes. It's also been lowered, and that I'm not so keen on because, well, the ride just isn't right. These have very fancy electronically controlled adaptive dampers, and you can't really remove them. So what the car has is a set of lowering springs, H&R, so decent quality, but on a suspension that I don't think knows what's going on, and it's suffered. It is sat on some very, very nice 19-inch alloys, which I do really like, and, believe it or not, I don't even mind what he's done with the exhaust. I gave him a bit of a hard time with the C5 because that had a very, very fruity setup, and it just didn't sound very good at all. This is much better. Having a 6-cylinder up front meant that it had a chance. I mean, a 4-cylinder diesel is just never going to make a nice noise, but when you get 5, 6 or 8 cylinders, you are in with a shot, and this I think actually is very well judged. You put your foot down, you can hear it, it's pleasant, but when you back off, you just get that distant burble and it's not intrusive. the ride quality is definitely compromised, and for me, if you're going to buy something like this, oh my word, that is really cool. Lovely old tractor, that. And yeah, if you're going to buy something like this, surely part of the point of it is comfort. And that brings me back onto my main point, which is that throughout history, if you were to ask people what marks out a French car, they would say the ride quality. It is something for which the likes of Citroën have become world famous. In fact, so good was the Citroën suspension system that Rolls-Royce effectively said, can we use that for our cars? Because we want the best in the world, and that's it. It's one of the reasons I quite like my own Citroën BX. I always wanted to own a car with the hydro pneumatic setup, and I'm glad that I do. Yeah, that's not what French cars should ride like. The other word that is also almost guaranteed to crop up when talking about French cars is quirky. And though there will always be a place in the world for the likes of the Audi A8, very business-like cars that are deliberately understated and, yes, very well put together, but ultimately not flashy or showy, on the other end you'll then get cars like your Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, statements of opulence and wealth. But in the middle, I think there has always been room for cars that do things a little bit differently. They're not as deliberately gaudy, flashy or showy as, say, a Bentley, nor are they anywhere near as tedious and perhaps dull as your Audis. I'm being a little bit needlessly harsh there. And this is where French cars have often done quite so well. They've never really been as stylish as, say, something Italian, but they have their own charm, the Gallic flair, journalists like to call it. And so they are a natural fit for your luxury car, for somebody that wants something a little bit different. Combine that with excellent ride quality, and surely that is a recipe for success. And yet, it would appear that in fact, it is actually a recipe for disaster. And just about every time in the last 50 years, a French manufacturer has tried to make a more upmarket executive car, it's failed spectacularly. Why is that? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more just after I've put the 407 through its paces. It's certainly competent enough, and I've got absolutely no complaints about the pace of the thing. It feels very nicely judged, and having more torque than power does suit a large, more luxurious continent cruiser. This will also do very good fuel economy, in excess of 42 the gallon, meaning you can get just about 600 miles to a tank in this, which is nice. I do really like the aftermarket Peugeot RCZ steering wheel. I'm a real fan of it. It's lovely. The original would have been quite a bit duller and larger. The feel through it is not exactly sensational, but still, you do get a fairly good idea of what the car is doing. On a dry day like today, the front tyres are not protesting too much in spite of what they're being asked to do, and torque steer, though present, I can't say is actually all that problematic. Although Lewis did mention it to me earlier, and he said that if you do catch the car on the wrong road, it can be an issue. Still, I haven't, so I've thus far no complaints about it. I think really I would much prefer this car if it were standard, and there the suspension would be allowed to do its job a little bit better. And as it happens, that is one of the best features of the 407. It is a setup derived essentially from the Citroën C6, another French attempt at an upmarket car that failed miserably. And what you have here up front is a double wishbone suspension, and out back a multi-link one. Far better than you'd have found on anything equivalent in German of the day, which I suspect would have probably just had McPherson struts. These never really steered quite as nicely as the outgoing 406, but you know what, in all honesty, it's not actually terrible. There are many cars out there that people really rave about with far worse steering than this. I'm going to upset a few people now and say that actually it's probably just as good, if not better, than say an E46 3 Series. If you have driven or you own one of those and you believe that the steering in an E46 M3 is great, do me and you a favour. Go and drive a 987 Cayman, most 911s, particularly older ones, or just about any Lotus, and then tell me the steering in an E46 M3 is great, because you'll not be able to. Anyway, back to the French. I sometimes think a lot of this dates back to the end of the Second World War, when France introduced a horsepower tax, something that a lot of countries around the world did. And the idea behind it was simple. They wanted to encourage car makers to build vehicles that the public could afford. A public that was trying to rebuild, and a public that didn't have all that much money. They didn't want the makers to go for the low-hanging fruit of markets like America, which hadn't suffered quite to the same extent and bounced back a little bit sooner, and then began buying more luxurious goods a lot faster than those in Europe. So the idea was, make sure cars were available to the locals at a price they could afford. This produced some amazing cars, the likes of the 2CV, the 4CV, which actually share their name with some of the horsepower limitations. There weren't actually 2 or 4 horsepower cars, but they had different categories, and I believe a version of this system still exists today, though based on different metrics. In Britain, we actually had a similar system, based, I believe, on the bore of an engine. This is why you had Jaguars with extraordinarily long-stroke engines, because they were limited in bore size, so the only way they could get a bigger engine was by increasing the stroke. I think it was like 3 inches maximum bore or something like that before you started paying a lot more tax. Italy, of course, has long been famous for the limit they had on cars, the 2-litre one, which meant even the likes of Ferrari created versions of their cars specifically for the Italian market. In the early days, I don't think this was much of a problem, because everybody was essentially doing the same thing. Everybody was building small, affordable, accessible cars, except the Americans, who very quickly started chucking V8s at everything and anything that they could. However, as the economies of the world started to recover, as things began to get a little better, most of these markets eventually started to relax their restrictions in some way, shape or form. However, the French, I believe, were a little bit slow on the uptake, and even the likes of the Citroën DS, I think rightly regarded as one of the finest cars in the world and a great French luxury success story, was criticised for just one thing. Its engine simply wasn't big enough. This was a car that cost a fortune, and though all and sundry that drove it loved it, the simple fact was, in the USA, you could buy something with about 4 times the power for the same price. So why wouldn't you? They also drove on a very different type of road, and the American approach to suspension was very different. Instead of the technological and clever solution that Citroën had, they just put really soft dampers and springs on their cars and achieved, I suppose you could call it, a similar effect, but at a much lower cost. American audiences very quickly became obsessed with bang for buck, how many cubic inches you can get for your dollar. Europeans have rarely been able to compete on that front. But that didn't stop a whole bunch of other nations producing some very, very successful cars. And I wager you ask any American or Brit what they would choose if they wanted a nice car, and they're likely to say BMW, Audi or Mercedes. In the US, they're also highly likely to say Lexus, a brand that was built specifically to appeal to the tastes of Americans that wanted to spend a little bit more money. And this is particularly interesting because if you look at your automotive history, you'll see that for a very long time, Japanese cars in America were probably viewed a similar way to French cars are here. Great if you want something small and affordable, with the caveat, I suppose, being that the Japanese stuff was also reliable. French has never had a reputation for that, but let's ignore that. However, nobody in the States ever thought Japanese when it came to luxury cars. Toyota didn't like that, and so the Lexus brand was born, and not only was it a success, but it actually became the automotive success story for me of the 80s and 90s. And today, both Toyota and Lexus are some of America's most popular brands, with Lexus really, I think, being the go-to choice for people that want something a little bit more upmarket. Maybe the durability and customer service has a lot to do with that, because Americans do a lot of miles. British brands, I would say, also do fairly well over there, and though you don't tend to see many Jaguars, you do see Range Rovers, you'll also see the odd Bentley and Rolls-Royce, particularly if you're in the likes of LA or New York. There's also naturally a bunch of homegrown brands that I tend to forget, the likes of Lincoln, Cadillac, so on and so forth, but as we don't really get those here, I kind of ignore them. And credit where credit is due, the Americans also seem to be a little bit less prejudiced than we are when it comes to their badges, because of late the Genesis brand has also been doing very well. In case you're not familiar with it, that is essentially to Hyundai and Kia what Lexus is to Toyota. So a member of the same family, but different badge, similar chassis, but just more upmarket versions of everything. The French, meanwhile, don't even get a look into the American market. And I was shocked to realise today, I'd suspected it for a while, but I didn't want to believe it. And if I have got this wrong, someone please hop in the comments and correct me. But at this point in time, 2024, there is not a single French brand in showrooms in the United States of America. That's shocking. Not one. No Renault, no Citroën, no Peugeot. For my Americans, that's no Renault, no Citroën, and no Peugeot. And they mock me for the way I say Porsche. Here. Anyhow, this I think is an absolute tragedy, because America is the market for your big luxury saloons. They still buy them now. Yes, they've always been SUV obsessed, and we are too now. We're not buying so many saloons, but the Americans, they'll buy these things. They will keep a brand or a model going on their own. There is a reason Toyota builds a whole bunch of stuff in the USA, because it saves miles shipping the things. They know their customers are there, so well, build them where the customers are. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that when the French have in the past tried to build a luxury car, because we're not used to the notion, it doesn't tend to do that well. But rather than stick with it, rather than commit, rather than put the resources and the effort behind it that Toyota did with Lexus, you had a whole new dealer network built out there, a whole model built just to show what the brand was about. You get generally somewhat more half-hearted efforts. And I think a lot of the problem is related to the engines, because you tell somebody, particularly 20 or 30 years ago, you'll want to sell them a big executive luxury car, they'll expect it to come with a big executive luxury engine. And I'm currently struggling to think of any time a French manufacturer has built a V8. Have they ever built a V8? Somebody tell me. I mean, surely it's been done. I know Honda, for example, have never built one, but Nissan have, Toyota have. Maybe they haven't. V6s can just about cut it in the USA, but anything 4 cylinders doesn't belong in a luxury saloon, and that's not just for the American market. That's a belief that I have that I think is also a correct one. You do not want to get into a nice big expensive car, put your foot down, and then feel that it's actually completely gutless. Ooh, nice. And actually, I must have a little bit of sympathy here for the French, because they were aware of this 50 years ago, and so for the successor to the DS, they aimed to fix that car's one flaw. And its successor, the SM, had a much larger engine, the 6-cylinder Citroën Maserati unit. Unfortunately for them, that car arrived just in time to be met by an oil crisis, and the world went, actually, you know what? Big engines, we changed our mind. Don't want them. And that car turned out to do the company absolutely no favours. It more or less bankrupted them. Gotta feel sorry for them. And I think the fundamental issue is that French car manufacturers to date have always known that there is just one market that they can truly rely on, which is their own. And so they build the cars to French requirements, which in some ways makes them brilliant, because French roads are kind of similar to our own. But this then means you get things like the latest generation of the Renault Sport Megane, and unlike all of its competitors that have a 2-litre engine, it has a 1.8. Why they couldn't then do a 2-litre for markets that aren't France, I don't know. But they decided that they could not. This car, for example, is not only really the last big coupe that Peugeot ever made, it's also one of the last cars they ever sold with the option of a more than 4-cylinder. Even the sportier cars they've done recently, the Peugeot 508 by Peugeot Sport Engineering, or whatever they called it, was a weird, oddball affair. A little 1.6-litre engine paired with a hybrid system that just didn't gel. It was just odd, it was just off. A little while back, a brand called DS was launched that initially was a sub-brand of Citroën and of course was designed to trade on the reputation that the old DS had. And the idea of this brand was luxury through and through. And indeed, there's quite a bit that they do right. I've attended a few of their events and driven a few of their cars. They've got some nice things about them, but there's also a little bit too much, well, formerly PSA, now Stellantis parts sharing going on, and they have been hampered by that same old thing, which is that the fanciest offering you'll get from DS is just about as potent as one of the weediest and weakest you would get from BMW or Audi. And that's just, well, that's a shame, really. Genesis understand that you have to give your customers some poke, and if there is to be any hope for the French coming soon, it is the transition to electric. I know as an automotive journalist I do a lot of moaning about it, however there is a good side to it. The likes of the Kia EV6, a 580 horsepower Kia, well that never ever would have happened with combustion engines, for simple reasons of emissions regulations. It would be too expensive for them to produce it, they would be fined, and it just doesn't make any sense for them. But EVs, zero emission vehicles, well, you can make a 1,000 horsepower zero emission vehicle, you can make a 100 horsepower zero emission vehicle. Doesn't really matter all that much. And if the French really want to be taken seriously, I want to see some proper flagship cars. Look at what Hyundai, Kia, Genesis are doing. Look at what can be achieved. Make the DS brand mean something. Make it so that when you get in one of those, I don't want to hear about 200 horsepower. I want to hear about 500 horsepower and a nice luxurious interior. You've already got your cheaper brands. You've got your Peugeot, you've got your Citroën, so on and so forth. Renault, of course, is a wholly separate entity, and oh crikey, I mean, I suppose I should give 2 minutes to talk about Renault's exotic cars. I mean, they've always had an admirable take on luxury cars. Even by Citroën standards, Renault's are just, well, weird. There was the Aventime, which I suppose wasn't maybe quite a luxury car, but was sort of trying to be. Then the Velsatis. Saw one of those the other day at Rustival. Fabulous show. There should be another one next year. I'd love to drive a Velsatis because, oh, they're not pretty, are they? They're just not. And I love that the French occasionally try, but that's challenging in the looks department, that car. Really challenging. And as far as I understand it, actually also a very difficult to own car because there are effectively no bits for it. You used to get the likes of the Laguna, oh, DB11 and a Turbo Esprit. Oh yes. I tell you what, people, it's been a great day for car spotting. I saw a Rolls Royce go past earlier. It was one of the convertibles, which one, don't ask me. There was an early, I think it's C5 RS6, the sort of first one. That's a super cool car. Don't really see those on the road anymore. Amazing. The weather's not even that good. But yeah, the French. I think they sort of half try. It doesn't really work. People don't really know what's going on, so nobody buys it, and then they just go, oh, well, we told you it wasn't going to work. So they give up. And that's a shame because they definitely have it in them to produce a proper luxury car. I love the commitment that was put into reviving the Alpine brand. If that could be put into making something a little nicer, a little more at market, and go back to America with it, conquer the States, I would love the French to have a proper nice car once again. But the issue is, and has always been, I think they need to just ignore the home market a little bit. Unless there is a way around it with the EV thing, which I think there might be. So, there we have it. Did you enjoy today's slightly offbeat rant? I wasn't really sure exactly what it was that I was going to say, so hopefully just a little bit of it actually made sense. As for this car, yes, the 407 Coupe is lovely, but lowering it is not a good idea. And I want to say a huge thank you to Lewis and Kirsten for coming out. Make sure to check out their channel, Limitless Media, and of course subscribe to both that, and if you haven't already, mine, click the bell icon, etc, etc, etc. Comment down below. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.